What if the true horror of a metamorphose were not waking up as an insect, but realizing that not even then do you stop trying to please others? Kafka exposes, without mercy, the fate of those who live to meet expectations. When you stop being useful, you stop being human. And that is the most brutal lesson that almost no one notices. Watch until the end and discover why trying to please everyone can destroy who you are. Warning: this documentary uses AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visuals are synthetic, the content is the result of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. On the 3rd day of December of 1812, Franz Kafka recorded in his diary an observation that foreshadowed his masterpiece. Grande repugnância ao escrever. Sento-me e não escrevo nada. 3 years later, in October of 1915, the publisher Kurt Wolff would publish A Metamorphose, a novella that began with one of the most disturbing sentences in world literature. Gregor Samsa woke up transformed into a monstrous insect, but his first concern was not the horror of his condition. It was the train schedule and his boss's reaction. If this kind of philosophical investigation interests you, it's worth subscribing to the channel. That helps this work continue. Prague in 1883, where Kafka was born, breathed the suffocating atmosphere of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The narrow streets of the Jewish quarter teemed with German, Czech, and Yiddish. But inside the Kafka household, the prevailing language was that of commerce and obedience. Hermann Kafka, Franz's father, had built a prosperous business in women's fashion goods starting from nothing. He was a robust man, loud-voiced and dominant in personality, who saw in his frail son a walking disappointment. In letters preserved from the period, Franz describes his father as a force of nature impossible to satisfy. Você me perguntava por que eu disse que tenho medo de você. He would write in the famous Carta ao Pai, drafted in 1919 but never delivered. Como de costume, não sei responder. Em parte, é exatamente esse medo que tenho de você. Em parte, minha própria fraqueza. What Hermann could not understand was that he had shaped in his son a strange creature, someone who interpreted any sign of disapproval as an existential threat. Franz developed an almost supernatural ability to detect nuances of irritation, anticipating criticism and molding his behavior to avoid it. It was a nervous system permanently switched on, an emotional radar that never rested. In editorial records from the time, we find revealing clues about Franz's relationship with work. During the day, he labored as an exemplary employee at the Instituto de Seguros contra Acidentes de Trabalho. Colleagues described him as meticulous, punctual, and willing to take on extra responsibilities without complaining. He processed cases of mutilated workers with a mechanical efficiency that impressed his superiors. But in his nighttime diaries, a different truth emerged. Meu trabalho é insuportável porque não corresponde ao meu único desejo e à minha única vocação, que é a literatura, he noted in 1911. Franz was trapped in a shell of professional competence, playing a role that guaranteed external approval while suffocating his true nature. He was Gregor Samsa before the metamorphosis, a man transformed into a function. You may interpret this differently, but there is something profoundly contemporary in this dynamic. Biographers of the period report that Franz lived in a constant state of emotional hypervigilance. When he wrote to his girlfriend Felice Bauer, his letters revealed an obsessive need for approval. He monitored every paragraph for signs of displeasure, rewrote entire sentences to sound more agreeable, apologized for feelings he had not even expressed. The correspondence with Felice, preserved in literary archives, exposes the inner workings of a people-pleaser mind. Não me odeie por esta carta, he wrote after expressing any personal opinion. Perdoe-me se eu disse algo errado. Talvez eu tenha interpretado mal suas palavras. These were the trademarks of someone who had learned that his safety depended on the other's constant approval. The contemporary psychiatrist Gabor Mate, in his studies on stress and autoimmune disease, identified a recurring pattern in patients who develop severe pathologies. The inability to say no, the compulsion to please, and the chronic suppression of anger. When we analyze Kafka's physical symptoms, the insomnia, the headaches, the digestive problems that preceded the fatal tuberculosis, we find the same clinical profile. The Kafka family operated according to a specific emotional economy. Franz was valued as long as he was useful. He financially supported his parents, helped manage his brother-in-law's business, served as a confidant to his sisters. But that usefulness came with an implicit condition. He had to remain available, docile, adaptable to others' needs. Any sign of autonomy was interpreted as selfishness, any expression of personal limits as ingratitude. In family documents from the period, we discover that Franz tried several times to establish independence. He planned moves to Berlin, considered marriages, imagined a life dedicated exclusively to literature. But each attempt was sabotaged by conveniently timed family crises. His mother fell ill when he spoke of leaving. His father threatened bankruptcy when Franz mentioned reducing his financial contribution. If you've already noticed this pattern in your own life, leave it in the comments. The dynamic is more common than we imagine. The work at the Institute of Insurance offers a perfect metaphor for the condition of the compulsive pleaser. Franz spent his days assessing industrial accidents, determining compensation for workers who had lost limbs or the ability to work. He was a bureaucrat of tragedy, processing human suffering through forms and reports. But he himself was an emotional accident victim, someone who had lost the ability to recognize himself as an individual separate from others' expectations. Colleagues praised his dedication. The family benefited from his generosity. Superiors depended on his reliability. Franz had become indispensable to everyone, except to himself. It was a ghostly existence, defined entirely by the function he performed for others. When he was not being useful, when he was alone with himself, he felt the existential void that only literary creation could fill temporarily. The tuberculosis that finally killed him in 1924 may have been only the physical manifestation of a psychic death that had already lasted decades. His body had become a symptom, just like Gregor Samsa. He woke up one day and discovered that his humanity had been consumed by the function he performed for others. Perhaps Kafka's true metamorphosis was not the transformation into an insect, but the slow erosion of a human being into a gear in the machinery of approval. The shell was not protection, it was prison. And we, readers of the 21st century, recognize in that shell our own armors of conformity, built brick by brick through every sim that should have been no, every smile that masked discomfort, every performance of kindness that cost a piece of the soul. In 1924, 3 months before he died, Franz Kafka asked his friend Max Brod to burn all of his manuscripts. It was the final gesture of a compulsive pleaser. Even in death, he tried to spare the world the discomfort of dealing with his words. Brod disobeyed, and today, a metamorphose is read in classrooms around the world. But do we truly understand what Kafka was documenting? Or did we turn his agony into literature, domesticating the horror he meant to reveal? The Portuguese neurologist Antonio Damasio, in his studies on consciousness and emotion, mapped the brain areas activated during experiences of social rejection. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that processes physical pain, becomes inflamed when we perceive signs of exclusion. In evolutionary terms, that made sense. On the African savanna, being banished from the group meant certain death. Our brain still runs on that Paleolithic software, treating a look of disapproval as if it were an encounter with a predator. If this idea also unsettled you, comment. The truth is that we carry inside our skull an outdated alarm system. When Gregor Samsa wakes up transformed, his first reaction is not existential horror. It is concern about the schedule. That detail is not accidental. Kafka understood something that neuroscience would confirm decades later. The pleaser's mind is permanently hijacked by the fear of disappointing. There is no space to process one's own experience, because all psychic energy is directed toward monitoring others' reactions. The Jungian psychologist Clarissa Pinkola Estes, in her studies on feminine archetypes, identified a similar pattern in women she calls doadoras compulsivas. They are individuals who learn to interpret any moment of non-utility as a threat of abandonment. The result is an emotional hypervigilance that consumes basic psychic resources. The person lives in a permanent state of emergency, unable to relax because there is always someone who needs to be pleased. Kafka lived this dynamic in an extreme way. Medical records from the period reveal that he developed chronic insomnia during the years of his engagement to Felice Bauer. He spent entire nights rewriting letters, trying to decode the tone of her replies, interpreting silences as signs of imminent rejection. His diaries from that period read like an instruction manual for a mind in constant panic. But perhaps the most disturbing part is recognizing this same dynamic in contemporary social networks. Shoshana Zuboff, in an era de capitalismo de vigilancia, documents how digital platforms monetize our need for approval. Each like activates the dopaminergic reward system. Each negative comment triggers the same pain circuits that ancestrally signaled danger of death. If you have ever obsessively monitored reactions to a post, you have already experienced a digitized version of what Kafka felt while waiting for letters from Felice. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar calculated that stable human groups rarely exceed 150 individuals. Our social brain evolved to track relationships at that scale. But today we are forced to manage the approval of hundreds or thousands of virtual contacts. It is like forcing an old processor to run modern software. The system freezes, overheats, collapses. The crucial difference between Kafka and us is that he still had literature as a release valve. In sleepless dawn hours, when he finally stopped trying to please, he wrote with brutal honesty about his own condition. A metamorphose is the self-portrait of someone who recognized he had become a function, losing contact with any prior human essence. The Hungarian-Canadian psychiatrist Gabor Mate documented clinical cases in which the chronic suppression of personal needs preceded the development of autoimmune diseases. In When the Body Says No, he describes patients who literally became ill from pleasing too much. Their immune systems began to attack their own bodies, a perfect biological metaphor for what happens when we completely lose contact with our limits. Kafka died of tuberculosis at 41 years of age, but his physical symptoms began much earlier. The chronic headaches, the digestive disorders, the severe insomnia, all of it may have been somatic manifestation of a mind at war with itself, a body that slowly destroys itself while the personality obsessively molds itself to external expectations. There is a cruel irony in this story. Franz spent his life trying not to inconvenience anyone, but he created a work that has unsettled readers for more than a century. A Metamorphose is perhaps the most disturbing text ever written about the modern human condition, precisely because it exposes the existential void that hides behind the mask of functionality. If you manage to subscribe to the channel during this chapter, that helps the work continue. This kind of investigation needs support to exist. The South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han argues that we live in the society of exhaustion, where we become our own exploiters. We no longer need tyrannical bosses or authoritarian fathers to keep us in line. We internalize the logic of approval so completely that we constantly self-monitor. We are Gregor Samsa and the family that rejects him at the same time. But here lies the fundamental paradox that neither Kafka nor we have been able to fully resolve. How do we distinguish between genuine consideration for others and unconscious manipulation based on fear? When does kindness become performance? Where does healthy socialization end and pathological self-betrayal begin? Carl Jung proposed that individuation, the process of becoming who one truly is, requires integrating shadow aspects of the personality. For people who spent their whole lives trying to be good, that means learning to be occasionally bad, saying no, disappointing, frustrating expectations. But that integration is terrifying for anyone who built their entire identity on being indispensable to others. Perhaps that is why a metamorphose remains relevant. Kafka offers no solutions, proposes no therapies, promises no cures. He simply documents with surgical precision what happens when a human being becomes completely a function of others. The result is a monstrous insect that still worries about train schedules. The question that remains, and that Kafka could not answer because he died too young, is whether a life is possible after we recognize our own shell. Can we become human again after discovering that we are insects? Or is awareness of one's own void an irreversible curse, a knowledge that condemns us to permanent isolation? In the final records of his diaries, Kafka wrote, "Posso nadar como os outros, só que tenho melhor memória dos perigos." Perhaps that is the difference between pleasers and the rest of humanity. Not that they are more vulnerable, but that they remember fear better. And once you recognize the shell, once you see your own metamorphosis, there is no way to simply forget and become naive again. The question that remains is whether that recognition is liberation or condemnation. Kafka never knew. We are still finding out.